Avatar from 2009 in 3D, the spark that lit up the modern era of stereo film. Recently re-released in a variety of formats, including high frame rate, which I'll talk about, and then towards the end of the video I'll get into a little bit about Way of Water, which is the sequel coming up. Curiously, in my neck of the woods, the only theater that was showing it in high frame rate was not a premium room, not an IMAX branded destination, but just a very typical mall theater, showing it in regular, real 3D stereo and high frame rate. So I'm guessing it must be an option built into many digital projectors made after a certain year. Now, as I understand, this was a variable frame rate presentation, so it only added the extra frames in select moments. And I felt it worked. It was a pleasant experience, and for me, blended in well. And after a while, I started to happily take it for granted without notice. The 3D felt sharp in moments where I expected it to be blurry, or perhaps a better description rather than blurry is I feel 3D can start to feel almost like a strobe light when there's a large amount of on-screen movement, especially if the camera itself is moving quickly. The eye struggles to focus and the stereo effect starts to fail and even get in the way of what you're watching. So the high frame rate, like in this scene in particular, almost felt like a slow motion effect, that when the picture starts to move and get busy, it has a calming effect on the brain, which is a little weird considering that it does show up during the more intense moments. Now, Avatar does also use actual slow motion in some of these moments, and it got me thinking and wondering if that was present not so much for dramatic effect, but to give the viewer a moment to soak in the stereo in what would otherwise be a busy moment. Overall, the 3D in Avatar was kept fairly tame. Now, it's not easy to film in stereo to begin with, and it's less easy to get something that is applicable to various types of eyes. To get something that people don't complain about. So I understand why they took a cautious approach. If you look closely, you can see some telltale signs of natively shot 3D. Notice how the wall behind him here has a slight twist quality between the left and right eye. Actually, if you look carefully, it seems to rotate around him in the chair, the center point of the thing. Natural 3D comes at each eye from slightly different angles, and a conversion doesn't actually do that because conversions don't imitate real life. To create that effect, they project a flat image from a single source through a rough 3D model of the area, not much different than holding your hand up in front of a projected theater screen. And even if you twist your hand or move your eyes a bit, the projected image will still stay at the same horizontal plane. Also notice light changes on some surfaces when we go from left to right. This, I believe, is known technically as twinkle, which is when an eye sees light that the other side doesn't. Look at the bottom right here. Water, by the way, is terrible for twinkle effects, which is interesting that Cameron decided to make his next movie all about water. My guess is the water will be all CGI. But I notice in this movie that he does take the realistic approach and render it with twinkle coming from the water as well. Indeed, most of this movie is a cartoon, so it was a choice to make the Navi shots, the shots in the forest, consistent with the live action depth, and also keep the light behaving in a realistic way. The movie overall takes the realistic approach, in that the bigger something is, the less stereo we see. This mantra, this concept, would be a common choice for the earlier stereo filmmakers from about Avatar, until conversions really came of age, which was around 2015. For example, the first Pacific Rim movie in 2013, the robots were all fairly flat, but anything on the ground had very wide stereo. Here, too, shots of things up in the sky have only a slight disparity. Some establishing shots, although they're very pretty, have little to no stereo, and out in space, everything's flat. Although inside the big spaceship, we do get what is probably our deepest stereo shot. For this shot, in the theater, I noticed I was focusing on the actor coming out of his sleep chamber, and I just sort of felt the long room being around him. And even around me, it had this immersive quality. But watching this scene at home on the TV, I found I was very much aware of the tunnel as a thing in itself. I was really kind of focused more on the background, and I'd say it looked really neat at home, but my mind treated the whole screen as just kind of this really neat object, whereas watching it at the theater, the larger screen actually drew me into the space. Now, I haven't seen this movie since its initial release. Surprised, I enjoyed the movie as much as I did some 13 years later. I'd say I had enjoyed it more this time, a lot more. And I'm not sure where this new appreciation comes from. Had you asked me a year ago, I'd have said I appreciated the look of the movie, certainly the 3D, but I really didn't care for the movie itself. Today, I don't know, maybe I've softened up a bit. I found myself touched by things that I actually quite disliked back in 2009. This time watching the big tree burn was kind of sad in a way it wasn't before. What really struck me was how they had a disbelief about that their institution could ever fail. It was impossible to consider, so the warnings of their two visitors were of no consequence until it was too late. I suppose you could also insert the question of, well, can your identity exist away from the things you identify with? If your workplace, your church, or even your family were to vanish tomorrow, which happens to some people, would you still be you? But really, Avatar isn't about the story or even its themes, but the world. It's a place to visit and explore for a while. It's a playground. Now, the concept of the playground is part of many script writing methods that state a movie should set aside a section in the middle where the characters are just exploring the ins and outs of the world they find themselves in before calamity comes to visit. The concept of the playground was actually even the driving force behind the Super Mario and Zelda games from Nintendo. The creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, wanted to create something that wasn't just about goals or reaching the end, but rather exploring and just enjoying spending time in the world. And that seems to be what Avatar is and what its focus is. You watch the characters explore and play in this colorful place. Plot points serve not so much as to move us forward, but they always seem to reveal some new aspects of this world. The new theatrical version includes an extra scene, really almost an extra shot, that essentially has the enemy say, "We'll be back." And I also noticed that its credits are flat, and I appreciated that. Unless they add some new graphics to look at, then I prefer the end credits be kept flat so that you can choose to take the glasses off and keep reading at that time. But it's really rare to have end credits flat in a 3D movie. In fact, I can't even think of another example. Now, there should have been a note in the theater before the movie started to let the audience know that there was going to be a Way of Water preview scene at the end, which is shown very early in the credit roll. My theater quickly emptied as the titles began, and I might have followed them had I not watched Variety Films review earlier in the week. Now let's take a look at Avatar: The Way of Water. Now, I've heard different places had different preview scenes. My theater happened to show this particular one. Now, I'm guessing it involved the kids of the characters in the first movie trying to swim with people from a water tribe, but the kids can't hold their breath for very long and had to keep coming up for air, and the water tribe are just kind of puzzled at their limitation. I guess they have yet to learn the ways of water. The 3D is nicely fleshed out, as you'd expect from a modern 3D movie. Full of realistic fish, and really underwater could have easily been mistaken for another ocean documentary. A very nice playground moment, and probably the perfect thing for me to look at in the middle of winter when it comes out. Now, from looking at these stills which come from the trailer, I do notice things like glimmer is on the water in many of these shots, and also in other scenes I can see some shading and small details are a bit different for each eye, so it was rendered in stereo in a realistic way. I've heard that James Cameron might be adopting a hybrid approach with occasional conversions, and there's at least two shots here that I strongly wonder if they are conversions, like this one. But judging by most of what I see in this trailer, The Way of Water is going to be mostly a true natively shot 3D movie, which we haven't had in a while.